Hello everybody. This will be your first code lecture, and we're going to be starting off with the first two modules, Intro to Code and General Rules, which is mostly section 2. I wanted to lay out right from the start that on your TQ, which this class will be writing on December 15th, you must use a paper code book. Okay, so I'm not sure what you're all using right now. You might have PDF copies, and the digital copies are very nice to search through. But when you come to write your TQ on campus, you will be using this beautiful book, right? Part 1, 2021 of the code book. So today's lecture is mostly on getting to know the code book, starting to work through it, seeing the varieties of information within it. But I just wanted to mention that you will have to use a paper code book on your TQ. So, what the heck is this book? Well, thankfully, this book tells us what it is and tells us how it works in section 0, which is the first section, under Object. So it states the object of this code is to establish safety standards for the installation and maintenance of electrical equipment. In its preparation, consideration has been given to the prevention of fire and shock hazards, as well as proper maintenance and operation. So that's a very broad first paragraph of what this book is. We need to get used to and learn how to do in terms of code class is reading comprehension. And what I mean by that is interpreting the questions that you'll have on tests, exams, and eventually your TQ, interpreting the questions and what the question is asking for, and then also interpreting and translating what the code book is saying, because, it's sort of a half joke that every code test is open book. The only book is the code book. So the goal is always to interpret what the code book is saying to give the right answer. So the object of this code is to establish safety standards. So this book is going to try to make some kind of standard, some kind of minimum for what installation and maintenance of electrical equipment happens. Okay, so myself, I find, obviously, I do a lot of highlighting. I read the book and I reinterpret it in my own words, because this book is written in a legal sense. It's written as if it's the Bible that all electricians and people that do electrical installations and maintenance must live by. So it's written in not friendly wording. It's written in what some people call legalese. But regardless of how it's written or how approachable it is, as electricians, we must learn how to use this code book and what it's saying in relation to our jobs. So let's slide down to the scope. And by scope, we're talking about what does this big tome, what does this book apply to? Well, straight away it says this code applies to all electrical work, electrical equipment, operating or intended to operate at all voltages in electrical installations for buildings, structures, and premises, or premises depending, including factory-built, relocatable, and non-relocatable structures and self-propelled marine vessels stationary for periods exceeding 5 months and connected to a shore supply. Holy, that applies to a lot of things. Except a few very specific situations. For marines and quarries, it says you're going to see a whole different document. The CSA M421, that's a whole different document. So the scope is going to lay out pretty much everything the average electrician is going to run into. This book will cover. And also in section 0, there's essentially 3 parts to section 0. We have just looked at the object and the scope. And then we have definitions. Now, in code class, the definitions in the code book are the only definitions we care about, okay? This is our dictionary in terms of code class. Merriam-Webster, Oxford, whatever they say is secondary to what the definitions in code class say, okay? That's a really important thing to remember. So let's look at one definition. It kind of relates to theory as well, which is ampacity. And what this definition is, I'm going to read it to you guys. I know you can all read it yourself. The maximum current in amperes, right? So that is what I is equal to. I is equal to blank amps. If you remember from theory, the math and theory class. So the maximum current in amperes, amperes, that can be carried continuously under the conditions of use. And then it's going to break it down. And this A and this B are what are known as items, right? So this is our definition of use, either by a conductor or by an insulated conductor. So the maximum current carried continuously under the conditions of use by a conductor without exceeding its temperature rating, or by an insulated conductor without exceeding the insulation temperature rating. Now, you'll see me highlighting some things, not highlighting other things. It's up to you whether or not you want to highlight your code book. As I said, at the start of the lecture, you will get a paper code book for your TQ. As far as I know, it will be brand new. So the code book you get to write your TQ will have no highlights. It will have no notes in it. So it's up to you whether or not you want to treat this code book or code class as if you're always going to write the TQ. I personally have always highlighted, because as you work through the class, it's going to highlight the important information that you've come across in questions. So I usually use yellow highlighter just for general highlighting. There's this Appendix B in blue highlight. We're going to look at that in a second. And if you see pink highlight, that refers to stand data information, which is not really necessary for this class. I believe it says in your module that, or your module talks about stand data, but stand data is not going to be referenced otherwise in this class. The module just wants you to be aware of what stand data is. And in Alberta, stand data is Alberta's alteration to the code book. So the stand data for Alberta only counts if you're doing electrical work in Alberta. Okay. So let's start to work through and sort of explore more of the book. So we have this ampacity definition, and then under item B, it's going to send us to Appendix B. Now, you might see a lot of my writing within the book, kind of a spoiler alert for Appendix B. Appendix B is going to send us to Appendix C anyways, but let's look at Appendix B, because if we look at, hopefully you guys can see that on the camera, if we look at the side pages of the book, the darkened areas are kind of how they divide through the book. So we're in section 0, right? This is section 12. And so you can kind of see what parts of the code book have the most information. And sorry, I had to readjust there. And by far, Appendix B has the most pages, right? Appendix B has all of these darkened ones. We have our tables. There's quite a few tables in the book as well. So let's go check out Appendix B. One thing to get familiar with is, and one thing that I recommend as a benefit to the paper code book, is you get familiar with what is where within the book. So when it comes test time, you can save yourself some pressure and anxiety by knowing exactly where to flip to. So we have Appendix A, and there's very little information in Appendix A. You can read that if you'd like, but I'm not going to touch on that. Appendix B is going to come up a lot throughout your school time as an apprentice. But a very important thing that is at the top of Appendix B is this note, which states this appendix is an informative part of this code. It is non-mandatory. So Appendix B is not rules. It's not changes to rules. It is purely informative. It is non-mandatory, meaning it is not a minimum standard that the code book puts out. It is just informative information for all of these sections, tables, diagrams, anything that has that C Appendix B beside the rule, or as we saw was beside the item of a definition. It's going to have a section in Appendix B as long as it says C Appendix B. So we were looking at ampacity. So section 0 is the first part of Appendix B. And as you see here, ampacity just says C clause C11.10 in Appendix C. So we're in Appendix B, which means Appendix C is going to be our next appendix. And here's Appendix C. So, as I was showing, Appendix B is non-mandatory, or it's extra information. It's to enhance your understanding of other parts of the codebook. Appendix C is a normative part of this code. It is mandatory. Now, there aren't really code rules in Appendix C. As it's titled, it's the Technical Committee on the Canadian Electrical Code, Part 1, Organization and Rules of Procedure. It's very exciting stuff. If you are struggling to sleep, I recommend reading all of Appendix C. Read your committees, general. It is exciting stuff. There is some good things in Appendix C, which we're going to look at, as well as that Appendix C 11.10 that ampacity is sending us to. So you see you have requests for amendments. So, these are ways to change the code book, essentially, if you'd like to get into that. Something to remember as you are working in the field is interpretation. So don't worry about that Appendix I for now. C 9.2 states requests for interpretation, shall be, so they have to be, they must be, they shall be submitted in writing to the project manager of the committee. You can probably find that online on the CSA website, on Part 1 in the form of a question that can be answered by a categorical yes or no. So if you ever need clarity on a code rule, you can ask, for example, does this rule mean this? And they should reply yes or no. Okay, that's only for yes or no questions. You can't ask this project manager, hey, what does section 12 do? How does it work? Okay. And right below that, we have requests for interpretation shall not be accepted for these specific things. So we're still moving on as we're trying to find, and here we are. C11.10 is telling us that the term ampacity, as defined in section 0, applies to the current carrying capacity of bare or insulated conductors only and shall not be used in relation to switches, panels, motors, etc. So, because Appendix C is mandatory, what this statement is laying out, you could treat as an amendment to the Section 0 definition of ampacity. So that's sort of how the different appendixes can work, some mandatory, some not mandatory. This is about a definition, so it's pretty specific. But I also wanted to go over to C11.1 because this part of Appendix C, or this C11.1, is laying out this, let's call it the legal language of the code book. So it says it right away, because the Canadian Electrical Code, Part 1, this book, may be adopted as a regulatory document, it is important that all rules, sub-rules, and items be stated in mandatory language in accordance with CSA guidelines. So mandatory language is maybe a verb in the form of shall. The code book is not going to say, well, you should maybe do this or that, and maybe this should be this way. It's saying you shall do this because it's a minimum. It's what you have to do. Or as shall not, if the negative is required. Requirements shall be stated in the positive rather than the negative. So the codebook would rather tell you what you shall do, because that's more of a stated minimum, than what you shall not do, because all the things you shall not do is a pretty big list, right? You shall not put a live wire into a sink. That would be ridiculous. So that's kind of an example of a definition. That's some of section 0. That's jumping to the appendixes. I'd like to just kind of sort through some of the ways the code book is organized and how they attempt to organize it. Apologies, camera adjustment. So at the front of my code book, I have a highlighting legend. Pretty simple. It's got my initials. And then in general, I use yellow highlighter, as I said in the beginning. And for the stand data, which is not a big concern for you guys, but you just need to sort of know what the module says about it, which is not very much. But I use pink highlighter, so that way I know there is an Alberta amendment to the Canadian Electrical Code book. So I know to look at the stand data should I be dealing with a certain rule. So basically the first part of the code book that really matters, aside from all the fun stuff, is table of contents. So what we have is a layout of every section and all of their what are called subheadings. So for example, we have section 18 is hazardous locations. It gives us a scope and an introduction to that section. It has some general stuff, and then it gets into explosive gas and explosive dust and the types of locations within those subheadings. So when you're trying to narrow down your search as you're answering code questions, the table of contents is pretty useful, but it's more useful the more familiar you get with the code book. For example, if you don't know what a raceway is in section 12, well then seeing raceways under section 12 is not going to be very helpful. The other way that you can narrow down your search when you have questions that you're answering is in the index. So one of the things the module talks about, and it's absolutely a good way to try to answer questions, is keyword searches. So if a question is asking about an AC module, just to take the first keyword in the index, and you don't know where to look for AC module rules, well, if you go to the index and that keyword is in here, then you can go, oh, well, it's either 64002, 106, or 110, right? So those are two ways to narrow down your search, which is pretty important, especially come test time when time is limited. Table of contents, a lot of people like to use the index as they start working through the code book. But as you get more familiar, the table of contents is also a good way to narrow down the search. Most people don't think about the table of contents, so I like to mention that. So, as we continue looking at the organization of this big, beautiful book, we're going to look at preface, or the preface, however you'd like to say it. It has some historical information. So, first code book was 1927. If you've ever seen an example of it, it's like a little pamphlet. It's quite small. It has new requirements, right? So every 3 years, for a while now, every 3 years they put out a new code book. So last one was 2018, 15, 12, 09, 6, etc., etc. Obviously, there was 4 years between 06 and 2, but since 2006, every 3 years they put out a new code book, which means January 2024, there will be a new code book. Now, for first period, you guys only need 2021, but that's sort of their structure at the moment. The important thing for us here in the preface or the preface, not sure how to say that actually, is the general arrangement of the code book. It is divided, as it says here, into these general sections, so 0 to 16 and 26 are the general sections of the code book. The other sections supplement or amend general sections. So, as an example, let's go to section 26. Section 26, for example, I just flipped to receptacles. So what section 26 says about the receptacles is code. Except if you were in a non-general section, so 26 is a general section of the code book, and then also 0 to 16. But once you're outside of the general sections and you're in something, for example, like this is section 28, this is motors and generators, pardon me. This is what we would call, or this is what I call, a boss section of the code book. So if section 26 says it, that's great. But if section 28, if a supplementary or boss section says something different, then this section is correct. Now, the boss sections or the supplementary sections are going to be more specific, right? Because they're not a general section. So if section 28 says something specific about motors and generators, then that supersedes what section 26 says, only when it's about motors and generators. So that's an important thing I like to highlight as we go through and look at the preface or the preface. Should learn how to say that. Then it has numbering system, subdivision of rules, good stuff to read. It points out that odd numbers may be used for new rules, except for section 38. So all that means is, well, let's look at where we're at. This is section 44. It goes 300, 302, 304, 300. It skips the odd numbers in case they want to put rules in between, for example, footlights and metalwork of fixed stage equipment. The outlier, of course, being, as it said, if I can find it here, section 38, elevators. I'm not sure why. Maybe elevators will never ever change, but this is elevators, dumbwaiters, so on and so forth. It goes 38001, 002, 3, 4. That's the only section that does it. Otherwise, it goes by odd numbers, which doesn't usually pertain too much to how you guys are going to use and interpret the code book. But if you're curious what the preface or preface is talking about, that's why. The arrangement is something else to know. So I have an example rule. I just pulled a rule that has all of these things that it's talking about. So it goes rule, which is 8,200, has the subrule, which is 8,201, and then everything after that is just called an item. So this is 8,201A, call that 7, I guess, Roman numeral 7, and then capital A. So that's about as far and big as a rule will get with its items. Another useful part of this early area of the codebook is conversions. So you'll see I do a lot of writing in my codebook. It helps me understand stuff. I have a multiplication symbol going from SI units to previously used units. I mean, inches are still definitely used in the field, but nonetheless, this is code class. And then division coming back. So if you have cubic inches and you need it to cubic centimeters, you take the inches and divide by 0.061. So that's actually a useful area of the codebook in general. If you have a smartphone, maybe you'd wonder why this exists, but it's there if you need it. There's also conduit tubing and fitting trade sizes. So in the codebook, everything will be in metric, as far as I know. So if you're talking about half-inch conduit, the codebook calls it trade size conduit 16. So I have this page saved because I've used inches for all my conduit tubing and fitting trade sizes. So when the codebook is talking about rules for trade size 35 conduit, I can't picture what that is. And a good thing that helps you understand what the codebook is talking about is relating it to field experience. So with all that said, just to close on that first module, I would like to just go through one of your module questions and show you all sort of two ways that you could deal with a question. So I'm not going to exactly answer it for you, but so I decided to use a question that I actually just didn't know the answer to off the top of my head, because I don't have to know the answer to it because it's in the codebook, right? And that's the point of code class, is your answers should be in the codebook in general. So how should the dead ends of underfloor raceways be terminated? Gee, I don't know. I've actually not personally worked with underfloor raceways. So to start off, I'm going to pick out a few keywords that seem specific to this question. So it's asking me about stuff being terminated. So that's going to matter, I think. It's asking me about underfloor raceway. So it's asking about a specific type of raceway. And it's asking about the dead ends. So maybe I need the in there, but probably just dead ends. Don't know what those are in my experience, but those are sort of three of the key words. So I'm going to go to my codebook, and there's two places that I would start. One would be the table of contents, because in my experience, raceways are usually in section 12. So I'm going to go down. Look at that, raceways. Okay, page 131. And I'm going to see if, wow, that's good luck. Underfloor raceways are right there, 143. So that's one way to find it. Another way would be to jump to the index and take, well, let's take one of the other keywords. Let's take terminated. Go under T. And let's look for the word terminated. Terminals, terminating. There's no terminated as a keyword. Okay, so that's not a good one to use. That doesn't narrow anything down. We could also go underfloor raceway, which is probably taking us to the same page, but in the index, it's going to give us the rules. So this rule to this rule relates to underfloor raceways. Also section 0 is probably going to define it. And if we wanted to try to narrow it down even more, we could try to look up dead ends. So it might be under ends, comma, dead. But I don't see it. Okay, so I'm going to look under D then. So we have deep, decorative, dead front, dead as applied to electrical current, which is a definition in section 0, but no dead ends. So I'm going to go back to my table of contents because that gave me a page number for underfloor raceways, 143. And that's nice because there's obviously quite a few pages in this big book. And we're looking for how should the dead ends be terminated. Okay, so where they are permitted, doesn't seem like that's going to talk about how they should be terminated. Methods of installing the raceway. Sorry, show that on the camera. Methods of installing the raceway. Doesn't appear to be in there. Fittings, maybe. And there I see dead ends under sub-rule 3 of 12-1704. So, just wanted to go through that question with you all to show the two ways that table of contents can narrow it down with a page number, or index can give you a bunch of rules, and then you just search within the section to narrow down the answer that way. Now, the second part of this lecture is going to be about your second code module, which is called General Rules, Section 2. If you see, my codebook has a lot of pink within this section. That's only because a lot of the general administrative parts of the electrical code is basically amended in the province of Alberta. So a lot of Section 2, you'll see the pink highlighter. You can copy that if you want. You can highlight whatever you feel, but just know that the pink highlighter is not going to pertain to anything serious in first period. So, Section 2 has two subheadings, I should say. One is administrative, right? So that's got we got permits, special requirements, application for inspection, fees, where you put the permit, how you put the permit up, the lifespan or the current permit, reconnection, in case the power gets turned off somewhere. There are code rules for reconnection. Pretty dry stuff in the administrative, as is usually the case. But one rule under administrative that I think matters more in the modern context is the use of approved equipment. So, what this rule is talking about is, as an electrician or anyone that is installing stuff to code, which is almost always electricians, we have to use approved equipment. So the reason I say that matters in the modern time is if you go to a homeowner's house and he says, hey, I bought these receptacles. Can you put them in? I got them off Amazon. They were a penny per receptacle or something ridiculous. He's saving all this money. If that receptacle is not approved, usually it's CSA approved, then the code is saying you shall not put that in, right? It's phrasing it as you shall, electrical equipment used in electrical installations within the jurisdiction of the inspection department, which means anywhere where the inspectors will be. So probably wherever you're working, there's an inspection department. Shall be approved and shall be of a kind and type and rating approved for the specific purpose which it is to be employed. So that basically means CSA approved in shorthand. Yeah, so I like to touch on that one because as the electrician, the onus is on you to only use, move that out of the camera, to only use approved equipment, right? You can only use, install, so on and so forth, approved equipment. Another rule that's important is 2120. Now, one thing you'll start to hear as you go through code class is defaults. What is the default? And what that means is if a question is asking about something, for example, what's the wire size, and it doesn't tell you what type of wire, there are things you have to assume based on the defaults that are laid out in the modules. So I believe the module sends you right to this rule. And the codebook even has defaults. So where reference is made in this code to AWG size, or wire size, you could also say, this shall mean copper. So if it's talking about a wire, it's talking about a copper wire. If it's talking about an aluminum wire, then it's talking about an aluminum wire. But if it's just talking about a wire, it's talking about a copper wire, unless otherwise specified. Another interesting, well, at least to me, an interesting rule is quality of work. So, the mechanical arrangement and execution of the work in connection with any electrical installation shall be acceptable. Why is this in here? Why is it shall be acceptable? That's a very vague term. Essentially, the codebook leaves room for an inspector to say that work is not acceptable. Now, they're not just going to say that randomly for no reason. But if we're talking about the mechanical arrangement and execution of the work in connection with any electrical installation, that's talking about things like if you've ever put up conduit, like if you've run an EMT rack or just run one piece of EMT on the wall, usually you're going to level it, or your journeyman should tell you that you need to level it, because that's going to fit this quality of work rule. We don't just, grab a reel of wire and kick it down the stairs and then just to, save our backs, because that's not really a good quality execution of the work. Those are sort of strange examples, but it's in the book. It's a rule in this book. So your mechanical arrangement and execution of the work as an electrician shall be acceptable. That's fair game because it's in the code book. So we're going to jump over to disconnection next. If you find yourself with a code question and it's a very vague, broad code question that you can't think of any section it would be in, it's probably a Section 2 question. We're going to look at this rule quick for disconnection, which is saying that no repairs or alterations shall be carried out on any live equipment except where complete disconnection of the equipment is not feasible. So what this rule is saying is don't work on live stuff, essentially. 3-way or 4-way switches shall not be considered as disconnecting means. Adequate precautions, such as locks on circuit breakers or switches, warning notices, sentries, or other equally effective means shall be taken to prevent electrical equipment from being electrically charged when work is being done. So, if you've ever turned off a disconnect and put on a lockout, tagout type situation, the codebook says, yeah, that's exactly what you have to do, right? You have to be able to lock a disconnect off so you can work on equipment that's not live. Now, I also would like to point out, we're talking about disconnection. We're not just talking about turning something off. So if you have a 3-way switch, let's say at the top of the stairs, and you turn the light off with one of the three-way switches, well, that's fine, but that's not a disconnecting means, right? The codebook cares about disconnecting means. Next rule we're going to look at is 2316. And as I was just saying, Section 2 is, it's called general rules. It's not going to tell you where you can install a receptacle or at what height. It does have receptacles required for maintenance of equipment, and it's just saying, in general, a rooftop unit, equipment on a rooftop other than a dwelling unit, at least one receptacle shall be provided for the maintenance of this equipment. If you've ever been in a commercial building, went up to the roof and looked at their HVAC equipment, you'll probably see receptacles attached to the footing or just the side of the unit somewhere. That's because it's required for maintenance of the equipment. But Section 2 is not going to talk about the specifics of that receptacle. That is in Section 26 for Rule 710, right? So Section 2 is general things, general rules, permits, enclosures. We're just generally talking about all kinds of enclosures over here. What is an enclosure? Well, it's always good to understand what the codebook is actually talking about in a real-world application. So an enclosure, quite simply, is just that thing, or usually like a box or an octagon, that you're going to bring wires into, you're going to bring conductors into, right? So if you've done housing, you probably put that metal box on the side of a stud at some kind of approved height, and then you bring your wire over to it, right? Strip the outside jacket, run the wire through the top of the box or the bottom of the box or however it's set up, and then you tighten that clamp down. That box is called an enclosure. If you've done commercial, or if you've just done conduit in general, and you have a bunch of EMT go into some square box, that box is the enclosure. If you have an octagon for a light, that octagon enclosure is, the enclosure. So, 2400 enclosures, type designations, and use, right? We have a C Appendix B. If you ever have that C Appendix B, I highlight it in blue because, hey, let's jump to Appendix B, see if it's anything useful for what I'm working on. So that was 2400, Appendix B. Pardon me, that's tables. 2400 is going to be somewhere close to the beginning of Appendix B. I still have to find my way as I go through this book. So Appendix B has enclosures not intended to protect against conditions such as condensation, icing, corrosion, or contamination that may occur within the enclosure or enter via the conduit or unsealed openings. So they're not intended to protect against things that may occur in the enclosure. They're more worried about things coming into the enclosure, not what happens inside of it. So that's the Appendix B for 2400. And then the rule itself has some general uses. We have the following designations of enclosures for electrical equipment other than motors and generators. So they're going to have their own specific rules for their enclosures. Shall be recognized for the intended use as specified in Table 65. So it's giving us somewhere else to look for these designations for enclosures, and as follows. If the codebook says and, so Table 65 and as follows, that means that it has to meet both requirements. Okay? Now, Table 65 is saying a lot of the same stuff, just more specifically. But if you've ever seen a box that, or an enclosure, I should say, that you could put outside, it's going to be a type 3R, and it's going to designate that somewhere on the enclosure, right? When they manufacture it and the manufacturer is making it for outdoor use, they put 3R on it. The only time you don't have to designate or label the enclosure or say what the enclosure is to be used for is when it's general purpose enclosures for use indoors in ordinary locations. Now, funny enough, a type 1 for use indoors in ordinary location is also something that you could designate. But back to the residential receptacle box example, you may not see type 1 on those boxes because they're just general purpose that you just use indoors in an ordinary location, right? The inside wall of a house is a pretty ordinary indoors location. So let's go look at table 65. It's going to be a lot more specific, and that'll be our first table we get to look at. So this is the table section. We're going to jump all the way to the back here. That's table 63, 64. And here we have table 65. So table 65 is broken out like this. I recommend for a lot of these tables that you get a ruler just to help yourself sort through like so. So table 65 has more specific things because, as you noticed in the rule, it said ordinary locations. Well, what the heck are they calling ordinary? So type 1, indoor use, accidental contact with live parts. Yep, you can use a type 1, or falling dirt. So an ordinary location would just have falling dirt according to rule 2400 and this table. That's what they're calling an ordinary location. Indoor and outdoor use, so it can be used in both. Now, this part of the table is all these boxes are good for outdoor use. The reason it says indoor/outdoor is if you could have a box, for example, that is going to be good for rain, snow, and external formation of ice, well, you can probably put it indoors where it won't deal with those things, right? So that would be called exceeding the code book. You can always exceed code. You can never go below the minimum of code. So in code class, your answers should be dealing with the minimum that code requires. Okay? So that's table 65. That's all I'm going to say on section 2. As usual, if you have questions, email me. You can call my office. And thank you very much.